No?
Right, first moment, one of you ready? Here. Woo! Affirmative's going to win this debate really simply. This research is good and it fills a massive hole of research into these minority groups. 4 things in the speech. Firstly, setup, then explaining why this is done well, then explaining why this dramatically increases the quantity of research, then explaining why this makes this research a whole lot more impactful. Firstly, 2 contributions in setup. I'm firstly going to make a series of observations about the debate. The first thing to say is just the negative burden in this debate is not to point to a few isolated instances of this being done badly. They have to not support the entire thing. We will show that there's a net benefit. The second thing to say is we are obviously able to support a coexistence of research. We can have both minority researchers and non-minority researchers doing it. There's not a trade-off in this debate on our side. They have to support fully autonomous research on their side. The third thing to say is that they actually just have to prove that their research even exists in the first place, right, at a comparable scale to our type of thing. Noting that minorities are systematically locked out of academia, they don't click their fingers and solve that problem on their side of the house. They have to contend with that. Second question in setup, what does this research look like? First thing to say is it's done by people people who do not belong to those autonomous groups that the research is about. It applies to things like all subject areas. So there's both the social sciences, but also things like medical research, so the impact of COVID vaccines on particular groups and those types of things. Thirdly, often as this is academic research, it happens in unis, so there's an oversight mechanism there. And the final thing I'd point out is that research is done in teams that are absolutely massive, right? You do have the head researchers, but also people who do go out into the field and do all that field work. Presumably on their side of the house, they have to cop every single one of those researchers being from a minority group that they're researching about. I think that's a very high burden. First argument, why is this research done well? This argument is important in the debate because if you believe that this research is done relatively well or is net positive, you should just almost intuitively support it. They have to prove that it's done demonstrably badly and is demonstrably net harmful. There are 7 reasons that this research is done well. The first is I would say that the researchers going into these fields tend to be relatively well-meaning. You do not dedicate your life to gynecology or something if you really, really hate women. You do not dedicate your life to queer people if you're incredibly homophobic. It is so unclear why the people who engage in this research do have malicious incentives. And even if there are a couple bad eggs, we would explain that the vast majority are incredibly good. The second reason is I think that these individuals exist within institutions that have reputational concerns, right? So unis want to look good on these sorts of issues, so they don't want their researchers doing lots of bad things. And I would note that that is exponentially important in the future as things like gender studies and queer studies and indigenous studies become more important for these unis. They want to be having good reputations in this, so they want their researchers to be doing good stuff. The third thing I would explain is that this exists within stringent academic requirements, i.e. things like ethics boards, which do impose lots of regulatory processes on these researchers. It is not open season, you do not just walk into the communities and can do whatever you want. The fourth thing I would say is that often in order to research a certain community, that community has to let you in, right? So if you would doing the research on the impact of the AIDS crisis on queer people, you obviously have to interview queer people for that to happen. If you are horrible to queer people, they will shut you out of that community and stop you doing that research. The fact that you are able to do the research indicates that the community has consented to it. Fifthly, I would suggest that you collaborate with other researchers in things like big teams. There are lots of people involved here, which provides a moderating mechanism for these types of things because many people are able to call out bad behavior when that's happening. The second thing I would explain is that research self-corrects over time, given that it disproves each other and builds on itself. Even if some of the research is good, that improves over time. But I think I would seventhly just project that personal experience is very helpful. It is unclear to me why, me as someone who's interested in men, has better epistemic access to understanding how AIDS operates, for example. But I would also explain that potentially, a lot of the time, personal experience can cloud individuals' judgment and their ability to step back and look at the big picture when they are colored by very valid emotional experiences that they have had, but might not be representative of the whole. I'd love to take a POI. Engagement is really important in this activity. I think it flips both balls. I think my speaking points should be 2 points higher. No thanks. I'll take you later. Second argument, why this dramatically increases the quantity of research. The first thing I'm going to establish here is that there is a current deficit of research into these types of groups. One, this is empirically true. Secondly, there is a historic lack of incentive to research into these groups because of things like bias there. And then thirdly, we suggest it's just less lucrative to research into these groups. These people have lower incomes on aggregate because as a response to oppression, that type of thing. And I don't think it's strategic for them to contest with, so if they do, she can mop it up at 2A. Second thing, why do we massively increase the quantity of research? The first thing to say is that we just have a much bigger pool of people that are able to do research and stuff. Like queer people are about like maybe 10 to 20% of the population. We just allot the other 80% of the population to researching into that. Secondly, I would note that we get a whole lot more money and funding for this research because it's not just the case that there is like now a bigger pool of people, it's a bigger pool of people who are prominent within their academic field, which is a way that is particularly important. But thirdly, I wouldn't mean that this funding is like quite robust, right? Because the types of professors we uniquely unlock are the ones who are higher up, who are likely to have tenure. So even when budgets decrease, like now that when you have like those like more privileged professors working on that type of thing, they're able to continue and that type of thing there. The fourth thing I would suggest is that this like research is cumulative, i.e. it builds on areas to explore over time. That we get even if you believe we get a little bit of a quantity increase initially, that increases exponentially as research like always proposes more areas to study there. And it would fifthly suggest that we increase the popularity of this research into the future in a way that is particularly important. Why on the counterfactuals they have to deal with a very, very small quantity of research, if any, there. The first thing I would say is that there's just like a lack of people about these autonomous groups, especially if they want to pursue a relatively intersectional approach in terms of like looking at the way that, axes of oppression like disadvantage people. You probably have to find people at that precise intersection, which does compound that numbers harm in a way that's particularly bad. Secondly, these people are structurally locked out of academia, so even if they exist in society more generally, you can't get them there. And thirdly, I would say that these people lack political capital to do more niche research, because if you're a disadvantaged researcher going into academia, you don't take a risk on the niche field, you want to do something mainstream, so you probably don't research into your stuff there. The final thing I'd explain here is I think I actually amplify minority voices more on our side, so actually get more minority researchers on our side. They might say, oh, you can crowd this out. But when this field gets bigger, when there's more funding, when it's seen as more legitimate, that is how you empower those groups to actually do more stuff within that field. We get more women and gender studies research as well. The weighing on this is quite simple. Even if you believe that this research is bad quality, which I give you a bunch of reasons that you should not, this is self-correcting over time. It creates more discourse and you're able to challenge existing research. Research massively increases people's quality of life in terms of medical and social spheres, and that is really, really good. I'd love to take the point.
Marginalized people go to school today. What kind of significant change do you get on your side?
What? Okay, if this team's gonna run that marginalized people aren't locked out of academia today, I think that's pretty ridiculous to say. I think a lot of the time, and even if that is true, I think the problem is that over time and funding and that type of thing, you don't get the most prominent ones. So it's maybe people entering now, all the undergrad classes are mostly women, that type of thing. But the people at the top, those researchers do tend to be white men. So, and those are the ones who are leading the research projects. Even if they have to wait 30, 40 years for their benefits to symmetricize, we are able to claim benefits over that type of thing. Why do we get more impactful research? This research firstly is just better because we get the thought leaders in their field who are the most established, who are better funded, who are able to investigate relationships between majority and minority groups more on our side of the house, which is the most impactful type of thing there, because of the way that power structures work. And often, as I explained earlier, lived experiences can misguide people and allow them to go down rabbit holes that aren't necessarily good for the research as a whole. But secondly, we tell you this research is taken more seriously because people have better connections, because people dunk on autonomous spaces all the time and think that they are silly. It is published in better journals, and you are more likely to be a talking head on CNN on our side of the house. That was also important because research that sat in the library and wasn't read by anyone didn't make sense and didn't help with policy stuff. So proud of that.
Thank you very much to the first affirmative speaker for their fine remarks and their friendly reminders on the rules of engagement with BOIs. And when they're ready, I'd like to welcome up the first negative speaker to begin making case in the debate. Here.
This is scary. I forgot.
I love POIs.
Shenanigans are
Not shaders are the best at Alexis,
You're talking about the biggest headliner.
can I have a sip of water, please? You went for the sleep.
I'll be good support.
Huh? What was it?
Yeah.
researchers exist on both sides of the debate, right? It's about who we're going to prioritise, and I think that looks like a group that currently lacks prioritisation in status quo, right? This first thing on framing issues, firstly, just to get this out of the way, they say that there's going to be these huge groups of these people. I think in small groups and pair projects and things like that, I think, yes, we would definitely prefer that to happen. Obviously, in issues where this is completely unfeasible, I think having these motions spearheaded by people and the main consult group become within these minority communities, I think that is what we're going to be looking for, and I think that is an overall net benefit. But let's get on to the first point, right? We talk about why that these researchers, they talk about getting these voices to be amplified, right? They say that minority voice is going to get amplified. I don't know why this makes sense, because I think it's pretty intuitive that when you have an increased number of voices, which we say that they will probably get if you get this more research, right? Why this makes sense? Because this consistently has led to majoritarianism. How do you speak out against this grain and get to stand out? We need a clarification on time frame there. But why we think their side uniquely locks out minority voices? Note that these voices, they say that these voices can coexist. We say this is not how this works. Firstly, prominent researchers crowd out minority voices. Firstly, greater access to publications. We think that from biases that already exist around those working within these publications, because they have benefited from this systemic area, we think that they do have better access to be published. Secondly, they benefit disproportionately from more prestigious schooling. For example, university grounds have been riddled with these systemic biases where they're seen as a white boys club and things like that. This is improving, but we note that current prominent figures have benefited at a greater level because they went to school in a time where this was the most prominent, right, within these structures. Thirdly, places where they work more likely to be of similar privilege because, hey, you went to this sick university, now you're seen as more great outlook because you're going from this privileged area, which leads you to being more privileged publishing spaces and things like that. But then also just this element of systemic racial bias. For example, we have majoritarian bias as readers when you're reading these things, meaning that people pick research that conforms to these biases. No, thank you. And that's why these research that people are creating from minority voices, even if they get on this big platform, even if they are things, it means they're not currently being recognised if you continue to push these people forward, right? But what are the impacts of this? If you continue to support these people who are already in these spheres, who do not need extra support in getting their research to be read, that is uniquely where minority groups are actually locked out. There's a lot of harms that come from this. Firstly, you're crowding out the meaningful inputs because we do rational that understanding does come from lived experience, and you're robbed of nuance that comes from this. And secondly, majoritarian research becomes the standard for future research, meaning that these implications only exponentialize as you go on, right? But then the main issue today is why the research is bad, right? Because they say that unis and people moderate and peer review and things like that, but when you don't have this go through people from the groups concerned, this quickly becomes a privileged echo chamber when you continue to support this. But also, considering we consider prominent people, right, it's probably a less pressing peer review process because of your reputation, because people are scared to critique you. I think that is always something they had to contend with. But uniquely, why on their side is research bad? Firstly, we talk about biases, right? They say a lot of research, especially in these areas of social science, which they deem to be so crucial, especially, for a lot of policy in governments and things like that, is necessarily shaped around social sciences. We think that when you have biases in this life, everyone does have them and they do interact. In imposing this standard, you carry biases with you, generally inspired by things like patriarchy and colonialism, right? Also, when people are brought in from university and high school and grad programs, where the rubric and what is deemed as good research has been shaped by the majority of people, I think this is also just as bad. But secondly, they talk about lived experience. They say that no matter your intentions, you cannot overcome lived experience in your research, right? They say uniquely that this leads to things like bias, but I think on our side of the bench, at least this is taken into consideration. At least this research becomes empathetic. Empathetic does not equal bad. I think because this lived experience exists and is a part of this community, it is something that should be looked into with research and should be taken into the greater scheme of things in that realm. But thirdly, there's a point that the research that they produce by these prominent figures is going to be harder to develop trust by these researchers, because you're not going to allow people to be able to opt in freely or feel comfortable in these experiments as participants, right? Because of this backroot of historic fears, things like colonialism, but also being experimented on in this sense. For example, when in giving African syphilis as a means to experiment on them to get medical research furthered. For example, the stolen generation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to see if they could assimilate into white culture and see if that was something that was going to be beneficial to them. Which means when you have participants in your experiment, it means that these people are not going to feel comfortable. They're not going to be able to live their true self in this experiment, and they're going to have this form of bias going in this, which means you're going to get skewed data and things like this. But also you're less likely to have people that opt into your experiments from all walks of life. For example, if you're going and you're putting a price on this like research that you're paying people, there's a lot of people who the barrier is not as high, so they're going to be like, I do not want to work with this white researcher, I will not feel comfortable, I'm going to opt out, which means you get this very bias-centric group of people that you are actually running this on. But fourthly, in interpreting this data, which you already have, which we proved to you is likely going to be skewed, we think that this can easily be misinterpreted because data is not just numbers, but there are people behind these numbers, which means you're going to have biases. For example, when we look at crime statistics of black people, where as a white person, consistently these are interpreted as being intrinsic to their genetic makeup, with this thing rising, for example, with the crime gene. Also, like things like babies, where there's a study where babies cried when they were placed an object in their path, whereas boy babies tried to solve this problem. This led to like a bunch of decades of data on babies growing up and how to raise them, saying that girls were emotional and could not handle this, whereas actually this was a misinterpretation. These girls were just trying to talk out their problems, leading to better communication skills, right? This is intrinsically a bad thing when you're misinterpreting that. Fifthly, interpretation is also modulated by the media. For example, the average person is not going to go to academic sites to be able to read through these full papers, right? They look at media news articles. Media and news articles can easily lock onto your interpretation of this data without going through it at its core, which means your misinterpreted results can then exponentialize when you get sensationalized by the media. I'll take one.
Noting that this is a prospective debate, if you really hate a minority group, why would you dedicate your entire life to researching them?
Why if you hate them, but you are from a minority group, so why would you hate the minority group that you come from and not want them to have good research? When they get good research from that, it means you intrinsically get benefits from that in terms of government policy and things like that. But the harms of this, as I say, is that research necessarily shapes policy. So in a world of very biased data, this is shaping things which governments look to for prominent researchers. For example, when you take into consideration this like crime gene that we bring you from black people, that looks to like these areas being over-policed, even when this might not even have to be a thing that needs to be contended with. But thirdly, why we get better access, right? Research wants to fill in unknowns. Because these groups don't see incredible levels of research in the past, this is uniquely where a vacuum of prominent figures means that you're going to get more funding for these people, and you're going to want to amplify these voices because they necessarily need this to actually get increased data and get this data pushed forward. In terms of access, we say there is going to be growing funding where there's an impetus for these people and they become leaders in this sphere. But also we just know that they do have institutional access, as much as they try and deny this, through things like AA. But also these people just can be fucking smart. They can be recognised in the field. They do have intrinsic qualities that means that they can get access to these institutions. You have no choice but to vote negative. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the first negative speaker for their final remarks, and when they're ready, I'd like to invite the second affirmative speaker to continue the discussion debate.
Oh, yes.
I just realized. I have a better phone now. Alright, thank you very much to the second affirmative speaker for their final remarks, and when they're ready, I'd like to welcome up the second negative speaker to continue their team's case.
So one of my closest friends was recently hospitalized because of a blood clot in her lung. She is a transgender woman, and this is relevant because despite there being very little research on the side effects of estrogen hormone replacement therapy, it was suggested to her that the reason this happened was because of her transitioning, and she should detransition in order to survive. Spoiler, untrue. So if these doctors were researching the impact of estrogen hormone replacement therapy on trans women, they would start from a position of wanting to prove that it is harmful because they subconsciously want trans women to detransition. It is simply much easier to reconfirm your biases as a cis person than to do genuine investigation. A trans person, while yes, having high emotions on the issue, would be concerned with their survival without any latent need to confirm that being transgender is an aberration from the norm. So we think that quantity of research is not a win condition for affirmative, because it is much better for us to have one thorough paper from a transgender woman on this matter compared to 20 papers by cis people who do not want transgender people to be on hormone replacement therapy, who want to confirm to themselves that this is not something that should happen, and as a consequence, we think we clearly win this debate. One, on the quality of research produced by majoritarian groups, and secondly, on why we get research from non-majoritarian groups on our side. So first, on the quality of research by majoritarian groups. And the first thing I'd like to investigate is the incentives of these groups. Because what they tell us is that research is going into these fields is going to be really good and well-meaning, because no one would enter these fields from a position of malice. They actually do care about them, and institutions also care about the reputation that they have to uphold. As a consequence, no one will do anything maliciously. First, we just challenge the idea of good incentives. You can interact with a group, you can conduct research on them without caring about them. Like, for example, Jordan B. Peterson makes a lot of research about the personality of women. I do not think he likes women. I think he wants to prove that women are evil. We also think that in the same vein, there are race realists that exist that want to prove that black people are inherently inferior, and they would enter those fields specifically to do those things. It's actually deeply unclear why anyone who enters a specific field, just because it happens to concern women or happens to concern black people, does so with good incentives. We would say that a lot of people, especially throughout history, and still currently do it with malicious incentives. Secondly, even if they had good intentions, they still produced bad outcomes and bad research, because there were just several things that stopped them from being able to produce good research on a structural level. The first was the systemic bias in education. For example, you were taught in sociology that women are biologically predisposed to wanting to be caregivers and wanting to give birth. You were taught in med school that black people have less pain receptors, so should get less pain medication when they are in the medical room. We think that people from non-majoritarian groups in those situations are more likely to question those aspects of education compared to if you're a white person hearing that, yeah, black people, they just feel less pain, you probably just do accept that. We think that black people would probably find that ridiculous on a counterfactual. The second thing that would tell you is the biased personal experience, because as both teams agree on, these people tend to be incredibly privileged people. They tend to have had a lot of social connections and a lot of privileged exposure in their upbringing. And we think that by virtue of their privilege, they necessarily have a degraded view of people from non-majoritarian groups. And necessarily, most of the exposure of black people probably is them just watching the TV and seeing the riots during the BLM protests and seeing the amplification of that in the media. We think that they tend to have very bad interactions with the people from the group that they end up studying, and as a consequence, we think that they end up producing bad research, or at least entering the research from a position of bias. Even if they have good intentions, they still have really bad ideas on these people, and as a consequence, that goes down into their research. The second thing is on process, and what they tell us on process is that the community has to let you in. By virtue of the fact that the community has to let you in, you naturally do produce good research. We would question that this, whether the community actually letting you in or you being able to conduct research on that community necessarily means that you are a person who they should have trusted and a person capable of producing good research. Because first, we explained to you quite clearly at Jade and to no response that there has been historical distrust from these communities towards these people from these groups because of things such as syphilis being given to black people by researchers, such as things such as lots of distrust because of the medical system and because of researchers specifically directly harming them. So we think that in the instances where the community does speak to you, they do not speak to you from a position of full trust. Even if they speak to you, you cannot guarantee that their responses are the most accurate. I'll take you later. Are the most accurate or are the most honest, but in the context of them fearing you. The second thing we'll tell you is because of the historical harms that majoritarian groups have incurred on these populations, that necessarily means that the ways in which they get information from communities tend to be quite unethical by virtue of them being, quite hesitant to speak to them on a direct basis with their way they're doing research. Because that often white or majoritarian groups have to do things in a more covert manner that is deeply unethical. And would give you the example of Pakistan, where they did just collect data on Pakistanis through the idea of giving them vaccines and things, but actually use it as a way for data collection. And we think that that is a violation of the human rights of these populations, and it happens quite frequently. They respond to us that even if you cannot just do ethical violations because people will scrutinize you, and they'll say that that's bad, and other researchers will call you out. But we think that these happen to groups that people do not give a fuck about. And so the level of scrutiny you get in response to actually violating their human rights is quite low. And we would note that other researchers who, as they characterize, will also be from majoritarian groups, need to engage in the same unethical processes to also produce their own research. As a consequence, this just happens to be an accepted fact in these fields, the fact that you can violate the rights of the group that you are seeking to research in order to collect data on them, in order for you to produce a paper that is deeply harmful. The second thing is we just think that the position of power also means that there's a level of coercion when you ask these people to participate in these research. So you end up making them doing things that they actually do not want to do, and they end up saying things that they do not believe in, and that's been deeply harmful to these groups. I'll take a POI now.
Majoritarian researchers obviously have a spectrum of intentions. Even if some are imperfect, surely it is better that these ones are called out and corrected by the good ones rather than having no research on your side.
That kind of is just unclear. I'll respond to this later. And so lastly is just in conclusions, and this is where the biggest change happens. We think that as someone from a minority group, yes, maybe you're more emotional about the issue. That still does not explain why you cannot be logical in your conclusions and actually do things that are for the betterment of your group, as I pointed out in the trans example. The trans person researching estrogenic replacement therapy want to survive. They actually have better conclusions compared to the counterfactual. So where does this lead us? Why do we get more research from non-majoritarian groups? And we just think that you have no crowding out of the research from the already existing minority researchers on our side of the debate. And we point to the idea of that, them saying that these people just do not have research or researchers is incredibly racist. Sansiddho is master's student, he's going to do PhD, he's going to produce lots of research, notably not white. My parents also have done research. And so I think it's just incredibly unfair for them to suggest that these people are not in these spaces and do not have the capacity to produce research. Because on top of those examples, there's just affirmative action that has existed for decades that means that there's a significant amount of these people at those institutions. Trust me, my dad from a small Kenyan village managed to get into Princeton because of that, and that's awesome. The second thing is the minorities also have their own institutions to the extent that they have, and that also means that you just would center research that comes out from those institutions. Secondly, we would say that there is an incentive for this research to exist regardless of who it comes from. That's because of demographics. Minority groups have more political power now. Political groups are catering to them. As a consequence, we think that universities also have a need to produce research about those groups, and they would fund scholars from minority backgrounds in the absence of there being white scholars on that matter. The second thing is we just think that research has reached a point where this is the research that needs to happen. It's oversaturated, so all the new research has to be about minority people. As a consequence, we think that there is just a lot of more research on our side, but it's from minority scholars. It is less biased, and that improves their life outcomes by a large chunk, because it means that you do not get bad policy that ruins their lives. It's never been part of proposed.
Thank you very much to the second native speaker for their final remarks, and when they're ready, I'd like to invite the third affirmative speaker to conclude it, well, not conclude the team's case, but continue the team's case even further in the debate. Here.
I'm going to start by being very sharp on what the burden on side affirmative is in this debate. I'm going to argue this in a slightly weird way because I know Eleanor sent this motion, but actually wrote this and it's a rejected motion from Melbourne Pro-Am. So I can tell you with great certainty that the burden in this debate is for side negative to defend no dominant groups doing research onto minority groups. So, when we tell you that this research is better because there is a larger sum of it on the whole, that is just an exclusive benefit that side affirmative gets to claim. What then is the change in this debate? It is necessarily about whether you actually crowd out minority research and you get worse outcomes there, or whether by improving the set of research overall, you give greater access to minority groups to do research in the future, and whether you give them sort of greater access via resources, whether this field becomes larger, whether this discipline becomes more accepted, and whether this quality improves overall. I'm going to start by assessing this in terms of incentives, and then two constructive questions in this debate. Firstly, who engages minorities, and secondly, and sort of contingent on that first question, where does research become better and worse? The first bit of analysis we get from second negative is to tell us that these incentives are particularly bad, with the one example of Jordan Peterson researching women despite hating women. Panel, that just like concedes all the material and analysis we give you a guide, because Jordan Peterson isn't employed by any university in the world. He got fired because these are incredibly dumb views. There are practices and standards that universities uphold to make sure that this is research of appropriate quality. There are incentives to do this well. If it is true, as second negative tells you, that this is becoming an increasingly prominent and important field, universities have an incentive to get out ahead and do this in a particularly good way. Note that one of the most compelling ways they can do that is by opening this field up, by having an engagement by major academics, because they're the big names who get their names in big published papers. They're the ones who can go on CNN and explain their findings in more detail. They're the ones who can bring attention to this field. They're the ones who can get $1 million grants to do projects that structurally disadvantaged academics just simply could never get the access to. The second thing they tell you is that there is educational bias, so people really accept bad ideas, like women being predisposed to caregiving. No legitimate sociology course for the last 50 years has taught this. Secondly, we're told that there's a whole series of people that are still inculcated with these biases. Panel, obviously we explained to you at the point at which you're an academic, you're likely to have a slightly better than the average punter understanding. We tell you down the bench to pretty glib response that these people are actually, these academics who are engaging in this work, probably in most cases are doing it in good faith. Even if they're not doing it in perfect faith, they're still much more familiar with the minority groups they're engaging with. They tell you on side negative that these minority groups are particularly likely to reject people from outside because of historical trauma and dispossession and things like that, which necessarily explains why you had to be a particularly good majoritarian academic to get into these communities in the first place. But no, even beyond that, it was just unclear that, we didn't even have to trade off that all this research was to be done by majoritarian groups going into those communities, because what we explained to you is that this will, on net, provide more funding for academics from the minority groups to go in and do that ethnographic research amongst their own community, and that was incredibly valuable. The analysis that comes out on bad healthcare for trans people. Yes, panel, it's incredibly true that some doctors are biased because they were old, they were educated 50 years ago. But note the fix for this is more research. Medical journals are published and sent to hospitals monthly to improve best practices. They tell you on side negative that it was better to have one study by a trans person than 20 studies by cis people. I just don't believe for a second that this was true or the correct weighing in this debate. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, we tell you that especially in processes like science, where there is rigorous peer review, there are accepted methods and studies, that this was necessarily likely to be a rigorous and serious process. You are going to be able to determine the effect of estrogen and hormone transitioning on people in a reasonably independent way. You have mechanisms like double-blind studies to ensure that this isn't the most biased set of research that they're trying to push on us. But secondly, it was unclear on their comparative that you had the funding for that one trans person to engage in this. Because we explained to you that trans people are a minority of the community. They are structurally disprivileged in a lot of ways. What that necessarily meant was, it was unclear that they were going to be in the same level of prominence, that they were going to be working for the Mayo Clinic and being able to do the most well-funded research. And thirdly, panel, they tell you that you have the incentive to survive as this group, so you're likely to do this research better. Obviously, you actually also have a competing set of biases because you believe that this is a good and positive therapy. And whilst it almost certainly is, that is necessarily going to bias your conclusions. It was not that this bias just made you necessarily better at doing research, because we explained to you that all people approach research subjectively. It was good to have 2 sets, 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets of subjective research than 1 set of subjective research. And through the process of debate and engagement, you could get better research out of that overall. So then, can we actually engage minority researchers on side affirmative? Because the analysis on side negative gives us is that these minority voices are not amplified. Firstly, just framing of this debate that sort of gets is tossed around a little bit on side negative. Obviously, these voices are marginalised in status quo. It's literally like in the info slide that they are marginalised. That means they are structurally disprivileged and disadvantaged. They are less likely to hold higher positions in the debate. Obviously, this wouldn't be a debate if most significant academic positions were held by people from minority groups. So, what is the comparative in this debate? It is allowing more prominent academics in to engage with this material. The reason that this is particularly important, because panel, yes, I'm going to concede that prominent name academics have more sway. They're going to have like a reputation which outweighs that of minority groups. I'm about to flip your entire argument, don't click yet. So, what necessarily happens as a result of this is in the comparative, they are probably disprivileged anyway. This was not a name which was a name that was known at home already. This was not a person with whom you were particularly familiar to begin with. What happens when we engage prominent academics? One, we tell you to fund this research better because they have a bigger name to attach to a grant proposal. Two, we tell you that this research is more stable because in a lot of cases they have tenure, it's much harder to fire them, it's much harder for this research project to be cut. And we note that these are big collaborative projects, so often they engage minority groups in this research anyway. It's unlikely to be a panel of cis-het white men engaging on every bit of research ever. That was just incredibly unintuitive. But obviously, panel, and the last and most important mechanism that we give you is that engaging in this debate is precisely what makes this research prominent. Because when Denning wrote that you should never do any research on which you are biased or have a personal position, that is what allowed Aileen Morton Robinson to write the most famous defence of Indigenous standpoint theory and explain that no, my subjectivity is a good thing. Aileen Morton Robinson would have just been a punter from a university on the Gold Coast had it not been that it was in response to something that Denning had written. I'll take the POI now.
If you are the only researchers allowed in the field and you contend it's of growing importance, how are these barriers still existing?
Because we explained to you that it doesn't get this increased importance without these prominent academics. We explained to you it doesn't get the increased funding. We explained to you that it's not necessarily, that these things don't just happen by themselves. We are supporting an improvement of something. It's not just that this field is getting better, because you tell us that this field is getting better, but we explained to you that the structures of society are still patriarchal. The structures of university still privilege men. This is unlikely to improve at a particularly good rate unless people actively care about it. We are the side that actively cares about it. The next, just the weighing on that argument of engaging minorities is that the rising tide, one, lifts all boats, and two, the comparative here in this debate panel is that you rely on old research. Old research is even worse, because old research is guaranteed to be done by the most racist, most homophobic, most sexist old white men in academics. What that necessarily meant was, even if it's newer, more progressive white people doing this research, it was better than the comparative where no research existed at all. We explained to you down the bench why this research gets worse. We give you 23 mechanisms in this debate. I count 4 that get a response. They give you 16 mechanisms. We've responded to every one. It's incredibly clear at the end of this debate that if you wanted to achieve more research, if you wanted minority groups to be able to engage in their own lived experience in academics, you needed to support them. You needed to give them this opportunity. So proud to affirm. Oh. 8:14 and
Yeah, like
99 seconds.
yeah. With 0.5 seconds.
You represent us well.
Oh, that's too generous.
Stands, you have to beat him on that.
Beat him on what?
Finish on 7 minutes. That's like
Yep, 7 minutes, exactly.
I'm speaking for 9 minutes.
If you
bro.
if you can beat it, this will make do for your crimes that you did earlier this
Against
morning
the
when I
gas
first saw you.
What crime?
Against Thousand Children.
Starbucks.
The Starbucks. This
I didn't eat Starbucks.
Alright, let's leave Sansa's ethics out of this. Thank you very much for the third affirmative speaker for their final remarks, and I welcome the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of the debate. Here, here.
I know debating tends to be removed from reality, but side affirmative really just takes it to a whole another level in this debate. When they just blanket assert that minorities don't get into colleges, they don't do research. Take a look around you. 5 out of the 9 people in this room are women. 5 out of the 9 people in this room are people of color. That should be reason enough to believe that this team is untrue in that case. But also, like, there are a collective of 5 billion people that live in Africa and Asia that can all do research on minorities living elsewhere in the world. It's deeply unclear to me why anyone in those countries, like, if this team is true and none of those people are structurally stopped from getting into university, then then I guess IIT Bombay is just a fad of my imagination. It doesn't really exist. Don't be like this affirmative team when you judge this debate. Judge this debate in reality, and we're going to prove to you why we win this debate when you take on a more realistic vision of what the world looks like. Let's first talk about whether or not this research will be done well. And here, I think Guy takes a page out of the Sydney Debater Guide and gives you 13 reasons why this is going to be true. But I don't think any of those reasons actually engage with the heart of the debate. They tell you things like stringent ethics and reputation, all of which are about the process of conducting research. But the way we engage with it on-site negative was to explain to you that the mindset you take in to conducting that research in and of itself is biased because you want to affirm things that you already believe in. But secondly, the way you interpret those results, especially from socioeconomic research, is incredibly problematic because the interpretation of things like sociology is incredibly subjective on your own beliefs and how you interpret those data. We explained to you quite clearly and to no response that this was something that was far worse on their side because that bias exists. What was their responses here? The first was to explain that this doesn't happen because people have really good intentions when they get into it. They already concede that there are people like Jordan Peterson, who, by the way, is hired by the University of Toronto, so he is a university tenure professor. No. Secondly, even if that was true though, we explained to you that there were certain biases that were ingrained in you when you were born. So things like the place that you were born in, things like the history that you were taught from a really young age, all of which to some degree influences who you are as a person. And we explained that that meant the assumptions you made and went into these research with was incredibly problematic. We hear nothing of comparable sophistication from this affirmative team to prove you otherwise. They explained to you that there is no sociology class that's really fucked up in the current world in the education system. But bro, this debate isn't in Australia. This debate takes place around the world. And when you look at countries like India, when you look at countries like in Africa, you essentially find that they are still backwards, and there are people that do conduct this research there. Obviously, there are minority and majority groups in those instances as well. So this team presumably is happy for those biases to seep into that research as well, given that also, by comparison, that's 5 billion people out of the 8 billion that live in the world. That's, by simple statistic, is the vast majority of instances this debate takes place. So obviously that screws them over more than it actually helps them. The third thing they say is that, lived experiences are incredibly bad. But we tell you that lived experiences matter, especially when you're talking about socioeconomic situations. We're talking about how to improve people's lives and their welfare. Your ability to relate with that person matters far more, because it's completely ludicrous for a man to come up and say, women should just suck it up and not go for leadership positions. Obviously that's stupid, and we should not stand for a system where those are the most prominent voices that dictate the field of feminist research. Instead, we should have one that platforms women and people that understand. Their last-ditch attempt here is a few things. The first is to explain at Guy that this is a self-correcting mechanism because people will obviously criticize themselves. I think when you're talking about criticism, people who have already who have a lot of crowd might still get criticism, but the general public and the wider field is far more likely to believe them because they have the clout, as opposed to someone who's just a punter who's just having a crack at this. But secondly, I think when white men or cis men continue to reaffirm biases that other cis men are putting onto a field, and given that we've explained to you they have structural advantages that minority fields don't have. For example, structural biases in the kinds of publications they have access to, in the kinds of education they have access to. Obviously, that criticism and the support of that reaffirmation is far worse on their side as it is on our side, because white men are only going to play into that reaffirming than they are actually going to break it down. But if this debate is about calling out bad research, why can't minorities do this? It's unclear to me why we need the help of the white savior complex to get actual meaning criticism in the field of academia. Of course, minority researchers exist. Of course, they can conduct this as well. The harm here, however, is that even if they get all of their well-meaning intended research, is that it just crowds out the small minority researchers that matter the most when it comes to these socioeconomic circumstances. Because we explained to you that a vast majority of this research matters because of the way you interpret it, right? Because the interpretation of it is what leads to policy, is what leads to actual change in the way people believe about certain issues. So obviously when you have a gap there that this team cannot feasibly make up because of the lived experience barrier, you never actually get the meaningful interpretation of that research that can then translate into good policy. So in their world, they get fucked up policy, like the policy about trans people dictated by cis men researchers that tell you that you shouldn't go through like hormone therapy or whatever that is. So that's incredibly problematic on their side as well. But this has meaningful effect on people on the ground. It looks like people actively being denied treatment that they do care about, that is actually important for their livelihood and for their expression. So obviously this in and of itself is debate winning, because even if you believe that they get better research or more research, as long as that research is bad, that's in and of itself a harm. We don't want bad research to be the forefront. I'll take you.
If they are racist or transphobic doctors who are particularly dogmatic in their views, obviously they are the very group of people who only listen to prominent researchers from majority groups.
Yep.
At that point, we're the only team that has an opportunity to meaningfully change their behavior.
I got it. So, I don't know why you're uniquely able to change that behavior. I think minority researchers can also criticize other people that are working in those fields and call out people who are racist. But secondly, I think there's a spectrum here. So you have the really racist people, but you also have the people that are less racist but have racial biases because they grew up in a particularly white community, in a majority community. So those are things that still seep into the research. That's incredibly harmful. Let's then talk about quantity. And in fact, we're going to explain, okay, so sure, maybe they get more number of people doing this, so just by the number of things, this is far better. They claim that this gets you more funding. It's unclear whether this funding goes to minority researchers in the first place, or whether it goes towards reaffirming the problematic research that the majority group has come up with. So obviously, I don't understand what that benefit is there. But secondly, I would just claim that this is not a significant jump. They say that minorities don't do research. I've already proved to you in my intro why the vast majority of the, actually 5 out of the 9 people here are part of minority groups. So obviously that's skewed for our benefit than it is on theirs. They say that these people are locked out of institutions. We told you that there are things like affirmative actions that have continued to exist for the vast majority of things. So obviously you're able to get into these institutions. But when it's specifically about academia, things like AA are incredibly good because they make up they make it so that minority groups, and through things like diversity, they make it so that minority groups are minority within the field of academia. In fact, if you look at any academic research, it's incredibly diverse because it's done by a wide group of people. The third thing they say is that, they amplify more voices. No, we are the ones that amplify more voices by stopping them being crowded out. That means that these minority voices, which are the best research possible on that topic, is the one that's at the forefront of that discussion, as opposed to on the back burner. We also told you this meant that you get better access for people that are minorities. That meant you get better voices. In fact, we flipped that point on quantity and access. If you want to debate this in reality, we've proven to you that this research will be done poorly, and that the quantity benefit that they get isn't outweighed at all. We're incredibly proud to oppose. Is there school there or something?
Some postgrad class.
Alright, in which case, so the fun continues. Thank you very much to the third negative speaker for their final remarks. And when they're ready, I'd like to invite the negative reply speaker It feels weird inviting a reply speaker.
Oh yes.
I'll get used to it. It's
I'll
also
be
season.
replying.
Yeah, basically. I didn't clarify at the start. 1 up at 3, 2 at 4, 15.
No POIs and replies, right?
No POIs and reply, please.
Well, unless you want some.
Please take my speaking time. The affirmative was contingent on you believing that minorities were incapable of producing research absent of dominant groups. And in our best case, when they did, this research was bad. So 2 questions here. 1, why did we have better research from non-majoritarian groups? And secondly, why was the quality of research on their side so bad? So first, why did we have better research from non-majoritarian groups? We gave the very simple claim that these researchers already exist. Just because they are minorities does not mean they do not produce research. I think this is relatively uncontroversial. Moving on to second claim, there's just political reasons for this research to exist. And this engages with the claim they put forward on the only reason why this research exists because of white men actually amplifying the field and making it super important. We think that this first, just increasing sway of these demographics. We gave this to you at second, it was never responded to. The fact that there are political groups that have to cater to them, there are entire parties that have to cater to black people, that have to cater to trans women and things like that. As a consequence, there is just that impetus for these groups to exist, this research to exist. Secondly, there's just increasing entrance into these institutions by virtue of these people getting higher social standing over time. As a consequence, that necessarily means that they in turn pressure those own institutions to produce that research. We think that that means that we would still get funding on our side, despite all the contentions on their side that we would not get any funding. And that note that this was brought out in Jade's POI, where she points to the fact that the fact that queer studies exist as a field, black studies exist as a field, women's studies exist as a field, would be incredibly bad for these institutions, for those fields to just suddenly disappear because there were no dominant white people producing research in those fields. As a consequence, we think we win cleanly on the idea of these groups both getting funding and secondly getting institutional support. They tell us that these voices were marginalized. As a consequence, they just do not have that scale of support. We think that the nuance missed by affirmative was that white academics conducting research on non-majoritarian groups contributed to the problem and made these groups even more marginalized. That was our entire case that they failed to respond to because they crowded out these groups as a consequence. Affirmative thinks that you can just respond to bad research by white people and things like that, but they also concede that you have less of a platform in relation to these people, so you have less capacity to call them out when they give you bad research. So this idea of cumulative research that you get that actually allows for minorities to build off on white people and things like that is just non-existent. The extent where they acknowledge that you do not have the platform to respond to these people, you do not have the platform to get your own work that contradicts these white people's work, acknowledge. As a consequence, we think that that was really bad. The second thing that they tell us is that the quality of research on our side is just going to be bad because you're biased by your own experiences. And I would note that this is the only harm they actually pose about the researchers on our side. It's also just blatantly untrue because maybe you're biased positively towards hormone replacement therapy, but the fact that it could maybe positively kill you means that that is something you actually take seriously on the level of your own health and the health of other trans people compared to a cis person who has less, more incentives outside of, their own personal incentives, more wanting to confirm their own worldview regarding cis people compared to trans people. As a consequence, we think that bias that exists on our side is far better because it actually incentivizes you to produce good research compared to the biases that exist on their side, which incentivize you to produce bad research. We also think that minorities do just check each other. This was brought out to you by Sans, that they can also call out each other. They are not a monolith. They have diverse views on certain issues. As a consequence, we both got good research on our side for minorities and actually research that was paid attention to by the media on our side. Lastly, on why the quality of their research was bad on their side. And the biggest claim that is not responded to at all in the entirety of affirmative bench is that these people were just not trusted by people coming from these demographics. That meant that they often had to defer to unethical data collection, which violated the intrinsic rights of non-majoritarian groups, not responded to. It also meant that there was coercion and power dynamics in play that made non-majoritarian groups who participate in research that they do not want to participate in, also not responded to. We also told you that when they engaged from a position of fear, which meant that the responses they were likely to give to these majoritarian groups were likely to be inaccurate responses, also not responded to. So that's an independent part of victory, regardless of whether these people are biased or not. They are not engaged with by non-majoritarian groups, and that's a reason alone to not allow them to conduct this research. Never been prouder to propose.
Thank you to the negative reply speaker for their final remarks and for not conceding their entire case with that final line. And I'd now like to welcome up the affirmative reply speaker to conclude their team's case in the debate here.
I think this negative team finds themselves in a bit of a twist. Because either academia is incredibly racist and majority researchers do really bad things, as they explain in their first speech, in which case I don't know why gender studies and indigenous studies departments get funded at all on their side, or that academia is very progressive, given the AA and examples they give you further down the bench when they start to panic, in which case I would believe that the majoritarian researchers, therefore, are probably quite good if they're a part of a very progressive academia thing. I don't know why they get the harms there. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you believe. Obviously, this was an affirmative slam dunk. I'm first going to explain why research by majority, I ask whether research by majority groups is harmful, then I'm going to ask how this affects the quantity of research. Because negative must prove on this first point that all majoritarian research is bad in and of itself, but this rests on two flimsy assumptions. The first is that there somehow is a trade-off with minority researchers, otherwise we are able to have our cake and eat it too. We explain that we expand the pie. We get bigger in gender and indigenous studies departments, which allow these people to get employment because you are able to have, white people with connections who are able to have nice lunches with the dean and secure more funding there. But secondly, so I think we actually amplify minority researchers on our side. But even if you don't believe that, I think their mechanism of crowding out doesn't make sense. Because the more that you believe that minority researchers are really good on their side of the house, the more they would rise to the top of their fields on our side too, but they would just benefit from more funding, being in a more integrated field there. But in the set of instances where these fields are really racist, where there are lots of biases, which are some fields, we uniquely explain that there is a benefit on our side when you are able to have someone who is structurally powerful advocating for you. We facilitated and legitimized that stuff there. The second assumption that their case rests on is somehow that this majoritarian research is done badly. We respond to this in a number of ways. We explain that this debate is not retrospective. They don't get to change the worst things that happened in the past. We tell you that in the absence of this new research, you lean on old, really, really racist research, which is quite bad. We also explain that this is done well. It is not enough for this negative team to point, for examples, for every malicious doctor investigating trans health. There's probably 10 structurally powerful male doctors who are desperate to see their daughter happy and desperate to see them, being healthy and that type of thing. That was incredibly good. They rely on an extreme and monolithic characterization of all these majoritarian doctors. We explain that there's self-correcting mechanisms, and even in our absolute worst case, this generated more discourse in a way that was particularly important. Positively on this issue, we also explain, even if their research is good, that it simply never gets out because you are never able to leverage the old boys club in a way that works for you. We explain these connections allow you to get things like funding, to get things like impact. Research didn't matter if it was locked away in a library. We got it around the cabinet table in a way that was unique. The second thing I'm going to chat about is how this affects the amount of research. And I would note that this negative team never attempts to contest this claim meaningfully. You should believe that the margin of change on this is absolutely massive because they just do not respond to it. We explain that people who have structural advantage and just on sheer numbers, right, are massively increased on our side. You do get a much bigger pool of research. And that was debate winning for a number of reasons. Firstly, it relied on the first question that you believing that research was net harmful in a way that was it just probably wasn't because of all the work I had previously done. But secondly, we explain this research self-corrects, you lean on worse old research and comparative, and this research affects literally everything and we get it sooner. I think it's pretty good if we are able to cure diseases faster, are able to get social policy that actually benefits these minority groups sooner, and that was something that was unique when you actually had that research and had more of it on-site affirmative.